Sprint review is a meeting that is held towards the end of the sprint. And essentially, sprint review is held to inspect the product increment and adapt the product backlog if needed. Which means this is not a status meeting. This is a meeting where the team, including the product owner, is going to demonstrate and present the working product increment to stakeholders. So what does it mean from a product owner standpoint? Well, from a product owner standpoint, it's important for you to invite the right people to the meeting. So the right stakeholders need to be invited. Second, it's important for you to know what was completed as what was done and what was not done. There will be a presentation element to this meeting. So the team or the product owner will present what was completed. This is what a sample agenda looks like. When you get into the meeting, the product owner invites all the stakeholders who are relevant to this project. There's an outline of what the goal is going to be. What's the context of this meeting? So you will probably talk about the sprint goal, and then the product owner will talk about what was completed, what was done, and what was not done. At which point the team might jump in and say, hey, while we were doing this, here are the kind of issues we faced, and here's how we got around to it. After that, there will be some sort of a presentation, right? That dog and pony show of the team saying, hey, here's everything we completed. That's for the stakeholders. During that, it's important for the product owner to continuously stay engaged in the conversation, because this is your window for gathering feedback from stakeholders. So as a product owner, you're gathering feedback during this session. And remember, this meeting, sprint review, can be a really valuable input for a sprint planning session. Because in this session, any changes that you've made to the product backlog as you continuously refined it, along with whatever comes out of this meeting, will potentially be a good list for what you could work on in the next sprint. So this could be a valuable input from that standpoint, right? So that's why I said the sprint review is essentially a meeting to inspect the product increment and potentially adapt the product backlog if needed. Yes?
I had a question. So typically, would the product owner have accepted the stories prior to going to the review, or is the product owner accepting the stories at the
yeah
that you demonstrate?
Yeah, so the scenario you described is basically what I've seen in most companies that claim they're doing Agile or Scrum. What happens is the product owner waits till the end of the sprint, and then in the sprint review, the product owner is actually getting a demonstration or getting a review of the stories that were completed by the team. That's a bad practice, right? You don't want to wait till the end of the sprint to accept the stories. As and when the stories are done, the product owner is engaged, so they're going to be looking and reviewing at the stories. So they're going to be accepting it throughout the sprint. The sprint review is for the stakeholders and get feedback from them and potentially incorporate that into your product backlog as an item and then reprioritize whatever you have to for the next sprint. And that's why this is such a valuable input for a sprint planning session, because you can get a lot of information here. Does that answer your question? All right. Validation board is a key concept in lean startup, and this is a technique that's used by companies, especially startup companies, to track progress and to gauge what's most valuable to them. There are two parts to this validation board. The top half tracks the number of pivots you make over time, and if you look at any startup, they would have had at least 3 or 4 pivots over the course of their history. I mean, look at Instagram. It started off as a location-based social networking site. It's something else today. Look at YouTube. YouTube started off as an online dating website. Now it's something else today, right? So your runway for a startup is defined as the number of pivots you can make over time. So this top half of the board is going to track those pivots that you have the ability to make over time. The bottom half is going to track all the core assumptions you make. And these assumptions are basically facts that you believe, if were invalidated, then that would cause the business to fail. The way you do this process is you start by laying out your customer hypothesis, which is you define your customers. These are probably a group of people with a common pain point. Then you write out your problem hypothesis. What is the pain point? What's the description of the problem? Now, you don't lay out the solution, because let's face it, every problem can have multiple solutions. So you don't want to back yourself into a corner with already predefined solutions. So you leave the solution blank. Now you get into the design and experimentation. So you start laying out core assumptions. Like I said, the facts that you believe at this point, if any of them were invalidated, that would cause the business to fail. The idea behind this validation board is to redefine your product as an experiment and then use that as a learning opportunity to learn more about your customers. So you start with your riskiest assumption, because regardless of how many core assumptions you have, if you pick any one of them and any one of them are invalidated, your business fails anyway. So you pick the riskiest assumption to start with. Now you're getting into the experimentation mode. There are 3 commonly used methods of carrying out experiments in any lean startup enterprise, right? The first one is called exploration. This is where you go out and get customer data, right? You go out and talk to your customers, get feedback from them, work out, get those basically high level use cases, usage scenarios and things like that. The second is called as a pitch. Now, based on the customer data you collected, now you make a pitch. And a pitch is basically your promise to offer some kind of service in return of some kind of currency. A currency could be anything from an email address or actual cash, anything the customer is willing to give up. The last method here is concierge. You invite a customer from another group and you walk them through their scenario. And you define something that can be simulated as an activity and you see how they react to it. These are typically used methods of experimentation, but there are a whole lot of other that you can use. And if you look up lean startup, then you'll see a lot of different methods of experimentation. Now, once you've defined your core assumptions and you've defined the methods by which you're going to experiment to redefine your product and learn more about your customers, the next thing is to define a minimum success criterion. This is the minimum amount of validation you need from your customers so you can continue building this product or you can actually work on this product. The minimum amount of validation, which basically means you need to have these things flushed out before you write any major chunk of code or you invest heavy money in building out infrastructure. Once you've defined these things, you go out to the field and you interview your customers. Once you've gathered a certain amount of customer data, it's time to analyze the results. Based on the customer data you've collected, if your core assumption is invalidated, which means what you thought was going to be true now is not true, that means it's time for a pivot, which means it's time for a change in vision. It's time for a change in the company direction. If you happen to have customer data that agrees with your assumption and that's not invalidated, that essentially means now you pick the next core assumption and you continue building on this. Over a period of time, now at least you have a baseline of what you think defines success for your product. And now you can choose to invest more money, invest more resources, and you can build out the lean startup. In a nutshell, as far as sprint reviews go, the product owner is extremely critical because this is the ceremony, this is the meeting, this is the event where you get actual feedback from your stakeholders and from your customers. So it's important to stay engaged and be present. Product owners cannot skip out on any sprint reviews. It's extremely critical that you are present in the sprint review and you are engaged. And getting the feedback from the right stakeholders is extremely important. The more diligent you are about this process, the easier it will be as far as your refinement and your planning sessions go for the future. Backlog grooming is this continuous process of how you add more detail to your product backlog. Typically, when you look at the big picture of how backlogs are refined, they generally have a 3-step procedure. You have a further line of sight, which is like 3 to 4 sprints ahead, and then you have maybe 1 or 2 sprints ahead with a little more specificity, and then you have basically what you're working on in this sprint. So when you look at continuous refinement for any project in Agile and Scrum specifically, it kind of has 3 stages to it. This is how you balance your focus between putting all your time and effort in focusing for the current time box, which is the current sprint, and building that realistic projection or realistic line of sight for over a period of time. So it's important to piecemeal your effort this way. There's only so much you can refine over time. So don't kill yourself in trying to get all the details for the entire 12-month project, but at least try to shoot for maybe a specific plan for maybe 1 or 2 sprints, and then 3 or 4 sprints down the road, get a high-level realistic projection. And as you go through your sprints, you will continuously buffer out time to refine your backlog so that you can continue to refine that. Here's an example of how you could progressively elaborate your backlog in your continuous refinement process. As you can see in this team, they've picked 3 stages, all the way from elementary, which is probably 3 to 4 sprints ahead, to junior high school, which is like 1 to 2 sprints ahead of visibility, and then high school, which is the actual sprint, right? So these are different stages of grooming or different stages of refinement. At this level, they're probably just looking at high-level information, like market trends, user experience, maybe really high-level epics. At this stage, they might have more of a visibility into what the epics are, so we can break them down into features. At this stage, they're probably breaking down the features into stories and making stories more independent, more small, and things like that. So they're progressively elaborating their refinement process. And by they, I mean the product owner.